October 30th, 1810. Just 6 weeks after Father Miguel Hidalgo issued the Cry of Dolores, his rebel army of 80,000 stood at the gates of Mexico City. Between them and the capital, 6,000 elite Spanish troops commanded by Colonel Torquato Trujillo. The Spanish were confident. They had professional soldiers, superior weapons, cavalry and artillery. Hidalgo had peasants with machetes and farm tools, but Hidalgo also had 600 trained Mestizo fighters, and they were about to change everything. This is the Battle of Monte de las Cruces, the victory that almost won Mexican independence, and the decision that lost it. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo stood in the town of Dolores and delivered a speech that ignited revolution. The Cry of Dolores called for independence from Spain, the end of slavery, and the return of land to indigenous peoples. Within days, tens of thousands joined his cause. Indigenous peasants, mestizos, African slaves, all the people the Spanish colonial system had oppressed. By October, Hidalgo's army numbered 80,000, but they weren't soldiers. Most had never held a weapon. They carried whatever they could find: farming tools, rocks, clubs, a few old muskets. They had no uniforms, no discipline, no training. The Spanish weren't worried. Colonial authorities in Mexico City sent Colonel Trujillo with 6,000 regular troops to crush the rebellion. These were professional soldiers, trained infantry, cavalry units, artillery batteries. They had modern muskets, bayonets, and European military tactics. On paper, it should have been a massacre, and the Spanish expected exactly that. The two armies met at Monte de las Cruces, a mountainous area about 40 miles west of Mexico City. The terrain was steep, wooded, and cut by ravines. Not ideal for large formations or cavalry charges, Hidalgo's 80,000 rebels held the high ground. But only a small fraction of them were actual fighters. Most were camp followers, families, people who had joined the movement but had no combat ability. The core of Hidalgo's fighting force was about 600 mestizo soldiers. These men were different from the peasant masses. Many had served in colonial militias. They knew European infantry tactics. They could fire muskets, maintain formations, and follow orders. These 600 would decide the battle. Colonel Trujillo ordered his troops to advance uphill and break the rebel lines. Spanish infantry moved in tight formations, muskets ready, bayonets fixed. Cavalry units prepared to charge once the infantry created an opening. It was textbook European warfare. Overwhelm the enemy with disciplined volleys, then finish them with a cavalry charge. But the rebels didn't fight like Europeans expected. The 600 mestizo fighters formed the center of Hidalgo's line. They held their ground as the Spanish advanced, waiting until the enemy was close before firing coordinated volleys. Behind them, the peasant army created chaos, screaming, throwing rocks, rushing forward in unorganized waves. The Spanish infantry fired back, but climbing uphill while under fire from entrenched positions was brutal. Men fell. Formations broke. The tight European tactics that worked on flat battlefields became liabilities on steep, wooded slopes. Then Trujillo ordered the cavalry charge. Spanish horsemen thundered uphill, expecting the peasant rebels to scatter in terror. Cavalry charges were devastating against untrained troops. The sight of mounted soldiers with sabres usually sent militias running. But the mestizo fighters didn't run. They held their formation, planted their muskets, and fired directly into the charging horses. The cavalry charge shattered. Horses went down, riders were thrown, the survivors retreated in disorder. Without cavalry support, the Spanish infantry was exposed. The rebels pressed the advantage. The 600 trained fighters led organized counterattacks while the peasant masses surged forward, overwhelming isolated Spanish units. By afternoon, the Spanish line collapsed. Trujillo ordered a retreat. His professional army, 6,000 strong, had been routed by rebels. The casualties were devastating. The Spanish lost around 2,000 men, dead, wounded, or captured. Hidalgo's rebels suffered losses too, but they had won. Mexico City lay open. The capital was only 40 miles away. The viceroy had fled. There were no significant Spanish forces left between Hidalgo and the seat of colonial power. All he had to do was march. And then Hidalgo made the decision that changed Mexican history. He retreated. No one knows exactly why. Some historians say Hidalgo feared his peasant army would pillage the city and turn the population against the revolution. Others suggest he worried about Spanish reinforcements arriving. Or maybe he realized his army, despite the victory, wasn't ready to hold a major city. Whatever the reason, Hidalgo turned his army around and marched away from Mexico City. The Spanish regrouped. Reinforcements arrived. The revolution lost its momentum. Within months, Spanish forces counterattacked and defeated Hidalgo at the Battle of Calderón Bridge. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811. Mexico wouldn't achieve independence until 1821, 11 years later. Monte de las Cruces was the closest the early independence movement came to total victory. If Hidalgo had marched on Mexico City that day, the war might have ended in 1810. Instead, it dragged on for over a decade, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. But the battle proved something important. It showed that colonial forces could be beaten, that peasants, when organized and led by trained fighters, could defeat professional armies, that the Spanish Empire wasn't invincible. Miguel Hidalgo's revolution ultimately failed, but the movement he started couldn't be stopped. Other leaders, José María Morelos, Vicente Guerrero, continued the fight, using the lessons learned at Monte de las Cruces. And eventually, they won. 600 trained fighters turned the tide of a battle. 80,000 rebels defeated 6,000 professional soldiers. And for one moment, in October 1810, Mexican independence was within reach. What do you think? Should Hidalgo have marched on Mexico City? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more battles where outnumbered forces changed history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because sometimes the decision not to fight is the one that matters most.